America in our nation's capital. Hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. So tonight, Forbes, America's leading business magazine and one of its oldest, is reporting something that most people in the United States would never even hear about. Some don't even want to accept after they hear it, I imagine. This is a data-driven study. You know, the type of story usually ignored by the corporate media that is much more interested in opinions and in getting Americans to go at each other rather than find a way to get along. So this Forbes story is essentially saying that Hispanics are now the fifth biggest economy in the world. U.S. Hispanics are the fifth biggest economy, not in the United States, but in the world. This story is done with research supplied by the conservative Peterson Institute on Economics. And it confirms essentially the following, that what is keeping the foundation of the U.S. economy afloat these days is not the big cap companies, not the huge corporations, most of whom have actually been making bank and milking the Fed and other institutions dry with debt for the last decade. No, it's been small to medium-sized entrepreneurs in our country who have been starting new businesses for the past decade, especially since the meltdown. The story also confirms that those doing the hiring in our country tend to be more often than not immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, and others, recent arrivals or sons and daughters of immigrants. In fact, here's what the Forbes report says. While the U.S. economy has exhibited gradually declining economic dynamism and the share of new firms being created each year has fallen, right? New companies being formed in the United States, foreign-born or Hispanic populations have become the engines of entrepreneurship, especially since the Great Recession. This is what Forbes is writing. Key factors, well, Hispanics are young, so they make up the youngest workforce in the United States. But according to Forbes, it's not just about quantity. They're saying it's really about quality. Quoting Forbes again, Hispanic arrivals have exceeded contemporary native-born Americans and some other migrant groups in their entrepreneurial capabilities and integration into economically relevant parts of the workforce. And here's another relevant part of the study. This is fascinating. Quote, by 2025, the increase in employed Hispanic labor could contribute more to the U.S. GDP growth than non-Hispanic labor. Contribute more to our GDP than non-Hispanic labor. Here's Steve Forbes himself. Here's how he describes it.
Old traditional stereotypes and myths about the Latino community have to be discarded with the garbage. And one of the surprising things is the extraordinary level of entrepreneurship. In 2012, there are 3.3 million Hispanic-owned businesses in the U.S. Now it's 4.6 million and rising rapidly. The entrepreneurial rate, you might say, the Latino community far exceeds other communities in the United States.
So what is it about immigrant entrepreneurship? Because it is different, right? And it's historic, right? Is it really any different than the Italians, the Jews, the Germans, the Irish, etc., who all came to America, and I think some people would say just simply more hungry, right? Also, how significant of an economic driver is it really for our economy? And is it counterintuitive as a report, especially in the Trump era, to even be reporting on something like this? How does Steve Forbes answer those questions, right? That's next, right here, on The News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it is time to do news again. GDP of the Hispanic population in the United States right now stands somewhere around $2.5 trillion with a T, right? But the velocity of that growth, based on the fact that Latinos are so much younger than anybody else in our population, is expected to reach more than 20% of the total U.S. GDP. So start doing those numbers in your head, or just wait, I'll take you through it. What that means is that the Hispanic population of the United States by itself is going to stand somewhere around the 5th biggest economy in the world. That's a conservative estimate. It could be more. If it were a country, if the United States Hispanics were a country, they'd be around 5. Now, let's take you through the list. The U.S., as you see right there, they're number 1. They're the Mac Daddies. We are the Mac Daddies of the world with a GDP of 19 trillion. Then comes China. They come in with a GDP of about 12 trillion. Then comes Japan. They have a GDP of about 5 trillion. Then comes Germany. They come in at 4th with a GDP of about 3.5 trillion. So guess who would be 5th? U.S. Hispanics with a nominal GDP somewhere around 3 trillion. That's higher than Great Britain. That's higher than India. That's higher than France. This is not a conversation about controlling the border. No one would argue that security is the most important thing in the United States of America, no matter where people are coming from. Got to make sure our country's safe first, right? This is a conversation about cultural attributes that move our country forward, no matter where they may come from. Because in the end, that's the most important thing, right? Here's how Steve Forbes describes that thing called the immigrant entrepreneurship patterns.
And what it shows is creativity and innovation and business startups can come from the most unlikely backgrounds. You don't need a Harvard Business School degree to start a successful company. You have to have the vision, drive, and the recognizing you're going to have failure from time to time. Every great entrepreneur has had serious setbacks along the way. But the key is, if you have what my grandfather, who was an immigrant to this country, one of 10 children, grade school education, who started our company, if you have what he called stick-to-itiveness, you're going to make a contribution, not only in what you do, but as an example for others. One of the surprising things about these surveys, which most people I don't think recognize, is that the work ethic, the idea that if you work, you can get ahead in this country, is stronger in the Latino community.
Stronger in the Latino community. Now, here's the problem for a lot of entrepreneurs, whether they're immigrant, Hispanics, or no matter who they are. Actually, some guy in Alabama trying to build a business as well. No matter how hard they work to build out their businesses, capital is not as accessible to them as it is to the big guys. And this is a problem for, immigrant Hispanics who are building their businesses. Even though they're having an enormous amount of success, they're doing so, some might say, being somewhat handicapped. Here's how Steve Forbes explains that situation.
What is really, I think, hopefully beginning to change is the whole reaction, especially after 2008, to lending. There's huge regulatory burdens put on banks where the cost of making a loan, small loan, which is usually defined as under $1 million, the fixed cost went up so much that a lot of banks just simply walked away from. Just wasn't worth the trouble, the expense, the regulatory blowback you would get. So in the last 8 years, lending really dried up proportionately for small businesses.
I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's